Will you be my wife?
No.
He was the most feared duke in England, yet he found himself kneeling before the girl who refused to say yes. London, 1852. In the glittering world of high society, one truth was absolute. When Adrian Rios, the Duke of Blackwood, made a request, it was never truly a request. They called him the Iron Duke. Politicians feared his influence. The Queen herself sought his counsel. Men twice his age trembled when he entered a room. For 15 years, no one had dared tell him no. Until tonight. Teresa Salvador stood in the midsummer gala, wearing a dress, the color of blood and rebellion. She was the daughter of a disgraced scholar, clutching secrets that could topple empires, watching as the most feared man in England crossed the ballroom toward her. Every eye in the room followed him, every breath held. When he extended his hand and asked for her alliance in marriage, the entire court waited for her curtsy, her blush, her inevitable yes. Instead, she looked him directly in the eyes and said the one word no duke had ever heard. No. The chandeliers seemed to dim. Fans froze mid-flutter, and Adrian Rios felt something he had never experienced before, the ground shifting beneath his feet. What happens next will change both their lives forever. But first, you need to understand how a single word can bring the most powerful man in England to his knees. If you're ready for more stories where the unexpected happens, where the forgotten rise and where the underdogs turn the game around, make sure to hit that subscribe button now. You don't want to miss what's coming next. And hey, drop a comment below, let me know where you're watching from and what's on your mind. Your thoughts are always welcome here, and I'd love to hear your take on tonight's story. Welcome to the family. Now let's continue. Adrian Rios had not built his reputation on impulse. Every decision he made was calculated 3 moves ahead, every alliance forged with precision, every enemy neutralized before they realized they were under attack. The Iron Duke did not gamble. He orchestrated. So when Lord Pembroke cornered him in the smoking room 2 weeks before the Midsummer Gala, warning him about a shadow coalition attempting to seize control of Britain's trade routes through the East India Company, Adrian's mind had already begun mapping solutions. Pembroke was nervous, sweating through his collar despite the cool evening air drifting through the open windows. "They have someone inside the Treasury," Pembroke said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Someone who understands the old trade codes, the encryption systems your grandfather helped design during the Napoleonic Wars. If they crack those codes, they can reroute shipments, forge documents, bleed the crown dry without anyone noticing until it's too late." Adrian took a slow sip of his brandy, his expression betraying nothing. Who do we have that can break their encryption first? Pembroke's silence was answer enough. Adrian set down his glass with deliberate care. Then we find someone who can. That someone, he discovered through careful inquiry, was not someone at all. It was a ghost. Thomas Salvador had been a linguistic genius, a scholar of ancient languages and modern cryptography, who had worked in obscurity until his death 3 years prior. The academic community had dismissed him as eccentric, his theories too radical, his methods too unconventional. But Adrian's private investigators had uncovered something else. Salvador's work on deciphering political codes was brilliant, and his daughter had been his closest collaborator. Teresa Salvador, 26 years old, unmarried, living in a modest townhouse on the unfashionable edge of Mayfair with her younger sister. No social connections of note, no fortune, no prospects. Perfect. Adrian studied the slim file his man had compiled. There was a small sketch of her, done from observation at a charity event she had attended months ago. Dark hair pulled back severely, eyes that seemed to look through the artist rather than at him, a mouth set in a line that suggested she had long ago stopped expecting kindness from the world. She was nothing. A woman with a brilliant mind, trapped in a society that would never acknowledge it, never compensate it, never even see it, which made her exactly what Adrian needed, desperate enough to be useful, invisible enough to be controlled. He would offer her something no one else could, recognition. A chance to use her father's work for something that mattered. And in exchange, she would decode the ledgers, expose the conspiracy, and secure Adrian's position as the man who saved the British economy from collapse. The Queen would be grateful. Parliament would be indebted. And Adrian would have eliminated his rivals before they even knew the game had begun. It was perfect, clinical, efficient. He would approach her at the midsummer gala, make his offer, and she would accept because women like Teresa Salvador always did. They had no other choice. The night of the gala, Adrian moved through the crowd with the ease of a man who had attended 1,000 such events. The ballroom at Somerset House glittered with candlelight and ambition, debutantes in pastel silk, mothers with diamond tiaras, politicians trading favors behind false smiles. The usual theater. He spotted her almost immediately. She stood near the tall windows overlooking the Thames, wearing a gown that made every other woman in the room look like they were trying too hard. Deep crimson with black lace at the collar and sleeves, cut in a style that was both modest and utterly arresting. Her dark hair was pinned up with what looked like her only piece of jewelry, a simple silver comb. She held a leather portfolio against her side, like a shield. Her sister stood beside her, younger, softer, dressed in pale yellow and clearly excited to be there. But Teresa looked like she would rather be anywhere else. Her gaze swept the room with the clinical assessment of someone cataloging exits. Adrian approached with the confidence of a man who had never been refused anything in his life. Teresa's eyes met his when he was still 10 paces away. There was no flutter of recognition, no blush of awareness, just steady observation. "Miss Salvador," he said, offering a slight bow. "Adrian Rios, Duke of Blackwood. I wonder if I might have a moment of your time." Her sister's eyes went wide. The Duke of Blackwood was a name even sheltered young women knew. But Teresa's expression didn't change. "Your Grace," she said, her voice calm and measuring. "I'm afraid I'm here solely to chaperone my sister. I'm not receiving callers this evening." It wasn't a refusal yet, just a boundary. Adrian smiled, the expression he used when he needed to appear charming rather than commanding. "I understand. Perhaps we might step onto the terrace for a brief conversation. I have a matter of some importance to discuss regarding your father's work." That got her attention. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the portfolio. "Your Grace, with respect, my father's work is not a topic for ballroom conversation. Then let's find somewhere more appropriate." Adrian gestured toward the terrace doors. "I assure you, Miss Salvador, this is not a social call. I have a proposition that I believe would honor your father's memory and provide you with an opportunity rarely afforded to women of your position." He watched her weigh the offer. Curiosity against caution, desperation against pride. She glanced at her sister, who was already being asked to dance by a young lieutenant with kind eyes. Teresa's expression softened for just a moment before the armor returned. "Very well," she said. 5 minutes. They stepped onto the terrace, where the night air was cool, and the music from the ballroom faded to a pleasant hum. London stretched out below them, 1,000 lights reflecting off the Thames. Adrian clasped his hands behind his back, choosing his words with the precision of a man setting a trap. "Your father was a genius, Miss Salvador. His work on cryptographic systems was decades ahead of its time. I've recently come into possession of certain documents that require someone with his unique expertise to decipher. I'm told you worked alongside him, that you understand his methods better than anyone living." Teresa's face remained carefully neutral, but he saw the spark of interest in her eyes. What kind of documents? The kind that could expose a conspiracy against the crown. The kind that could save thousands of lives and prevent an economic catastrophe. Adrian turned to face her directly. "I need someone I can trust. Someone brilliant enough to do the work, and invisible enough that no one will suspect they're doing it." He watched that land. Invisible. It was the truth, and they both knew it. Women like Teresa Salvador spent their entire lives being told they were invisible, that their minds didn't matter, that their contributions would never be acknowledged. Adrian was simply saying it out loud. "And what would you offer in return?" she asked. "Recognition. A contract with my name on it, paying you for your expertise, access to resources you would never obtain on your own. And when this is finished, a letter of recommendation that would open doors even your father couldn't unlock." It was a good offer, a generous offer, more than someone in her position could reasonably expect. Adrian waited for the gratitude, the careful acceptance, the inevitable yes. Teresa looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face. Then she did something he had not anticipated. She laughed. It was a brief, bitter sound, like glass breaking. "You want to use my mind but keep me invisible," she said. "You want my father's legacy but not my name attached to it. You want me to save the crown and be grateful that you allowed me the privilege." "Miss Salvador," Adrian began, but she cut him off. "No." Her voice was quiet but absolute. "I thank you for your offer, Your Grace, but I must decline. My father spent his life having his work stolen by men who promised him recognition and delivered nothing but poverty. I won't make the same mistake." She turned to walk back inside, and Adrian felt something shift in his chest. Not anger, not yet, but something closer to genuine surprise. He reached out, not touching her, but blocking her path. "This is not a negotiation, Miss Salvador. This is an opportunity you won't receive again." Teresa met his gaze without flinching. "Then I suppose I'll have to live without it." "Good evening, Your Grace." She stepped around him and disappeared back into the ballroom, leaving Adrian standing alone on the terrace with the uncomfortable realization that he had just been dismissed. By a woman with no title, no fortune, and no power. It was absurd, impossible, and absolutely unacceptable. He followed her inside, his mind already recalculating. If she wouldn't accept his offer privately, he would make it publicly. He would force her hand in front of witnesses, in front of the Queen's court, where refusing him would be social suicide. The orchestra was beginning a waltz. Adrian crossed the ballroom floor with purpose, aware of the eyes tracking his movement. Teresa stood with her sister near the refreshment table, her back very straight, her expression serene. But he saw the tension in her shoulders. "Miss Salvador," he said, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, "I would be honored if you would grant me this dance." The conversations around them stuttered to a halt. The Duke of Blackwood did not ask for dances. He indicated interest, and women appeared at his side. This public request was unusual enough to draw attention. Teresa turned to face him, and for a fraction of a second, he saw something flicker in her eyes. Not fear, something sharper, almost like pity. "I thank you for the honor, Your Grace," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet space. "But I must refuse." The words fell like stones into still water. Around them, fans stopped moving. Whispers began, soft and shocked. Adrian felt the weight of 100 eyes on them both. He should have walked away, should have laughed it off as a charming misunderstanding. But pride and something else, something that felt uncomfortably like wounded ego, made him press forward. "Surely you can spare one dance, Miss Salvador. It would be discourteous to refuse." Teresa's expression didn't change, but her voice dropped, meant only for him. "It would be more discourteous to accept under false pretenses. Your Grace, you don't want a dance. You want compliance. And I'm afraid I have none to offer." She offered a perfect curtsy, acknowledging his rank while simultaneously dismissing him, then took her sister's arm and guided her toward the opposite side of the ballroom. The crowd parted for them, whispers rising like a tide. Adrian stood frozen in the center of the dance floor, aware that he had just experienced something that hadn't happened to him since he was a boy. Public humiliation, not from an enemy or a rival, but from a woman who should have been grateful for his attention. Lord Halford appeared at his elbow, barely containing his shock. Good God, Rothschild. Did she just refuse you in front of the Queen's court? Adrian didn't answer. His eyes followed Teresa Salvador as she moved through the crowd with quiet dignity, her crimson gown a slash of defiance against the pastel conformity. She didn't look back, didn't hesitate, just walked away from him as if he were no one at all. And for the first time in 15 years, Adrian Rios felt something dangerous take root in his chest. It wasn't anger, though that would come later. It wasn't even wounded pride, though he had plenty of that. It was curiosity, sharp and unexpected and absolutely inconvenient. Who was this woman who looked at the most powerful man in England and found him wanting? 3 days later, Adrian stood in the shadows across the street from the Salvador townhouse, watching lamplight flicker in the upper windows. He had told himself he was being strategic, that understanding his opponent was simply good tactics. But the truth was more complicated. He had spent those 3 days trying to forget her, had thrown himself into meetings and correspondence and the usual machinery of power. But every quiet moment, her voice returned. You don't want a dance. You want compliance. As if she could see straight through the careful construction of his reputation to the calculation beneath. His investigator had provided more details. The Salvador sisters lived modestly but not in poverty. Teresa gave private lessons in languages to children of the merchant class. She visited her father's old university office once a week, though she was no longer officially welcome there. And every evening, the light in her study burned until well past midnight. Adrian waited until the street was empty, then crossed to the servants' entrance and slipped the lock with the ease of someone who had done this before. The house was silent, dark. He moved through the ground floor with care, following the faint light that spilled from beneath a door at the end of the hallway. The study was exactly what he expected. Books stacked on every surface, papers covered in mathematical notations, diagrams of encryption wheels pinned to the walls. And in the center of it all, Teresa Salvador sat at her father's desk, bent over a ledger, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders. She didn't look up when he entered. Her voice was calm, unsurprised. Breaking into private homes is illegal, Your Grace, even for dukes. Adrian closed the door behind him. How did you know it was me? Because no common thief would bother with a house that has nothing worth stealing. She set down her pen and finally met his gaze. And because I've been expecting you. He moved closer, studying the papers spread across her desk. They were covered in symbols he didn't recognize, languages that looked ancient and modern all at once. What are you working on? Teresa gathered the papers with calm efficiency, stacking them out of his view. That is none of your concern. You're decoding something. Adrian leaned against the desk, genuinely curious now. Something your father started. My father started many things he couldn't finish. Teresa stood, putting the desk between them. I'm attempting to complete his life's work, though I'm sure a man of your position can't imagine why that would matter to someone like me. Someone like you, Adrian repeated. You mean someone brilliant? Someone whose mind could reshape policy if anyone bothered to listen? She blinked, and for the first time, he saw her carefully constructed armor crack. Just slightly, just enough. Why are you really here, Your Grace? If you've come to make another offer, the answer is still no. If you've come to threaten me, I should tell you that I have very little left to lose. Adrian looked at her, this woman in a simple dress with ink stains on her fingers, surrounded by her father's legacy and her own impossible dreams. He had come here intending to persuade her, to find leverage, to win. But standing in this room full of brilliant, invisible work, he realized something that unsettled him deeply. He didn't want to use her. He wanted to understand her. I came because I made a mistake, he said finally, at the gala. I treated you like a tool instead of a person, like your mind was something I could purchase, instead of something I should earn the privilege of working alongside. Teresa studied him with those dark, measuring eyes. "That's a pretty speech, Your Grace. Did you rehearse it on the way over?" "No." Adrian smiled despite himself. "I'm making this up as I go, which is not something I usually do." She almost smiled back. Almost. "So, what now? You've broken into my home, admitted you were wrong, and I'm supposed to believe you've had a sudden change of heart?" "Not a change of heart, a change of approach." Adrian straightened, choosing honesty over strategy for perhaps the first time in years. "I do need your help, Miss Salvador. The conspiracy I mentioned is real, and without someone who can decode those ledgers, people will die. The economy will collapse. But I was wrong to offer you invisibility. You deserve recognition, partnership, your name on the work. And in exchange? In exchange, I help you finish your father's legacy. I use my resources, my connections, my frankly excessive wealth to make sure his work is published under both your names. I make sure the academic community that dismissed him has to acknowledge what he built. What you're still building." Teresa turned away, her fingers trailing across the books stacked on her father's desk. "Why would you do that? What do you gain? The truth?" Adrian waited until she looked at him again. "I gain the satisfaction of knowing I helped someone who deserved help, and maybe, if I'm very lucky, I gain something I haven't had in a very long time. A genuine ally, instead of another person who obeys me out of fear." The silence stretched between them. Outside, a carriage rattled past. The lamplight flickered. Teresa crossed her arms, not in defense but in thought. "If I agree to this, it can't look real. The moment society thinks the Iron Duke is courting the disgraced scholar's daughter, we'll both be buried in scrutiny. Questions, expectations. So we make it a business arrangement," Adrian said. "A fake courtship. Public enough to give you respectability and access. Private enough that we can actually work. And when it's over? When it's over, you have your father's legacy secured, and the freedom to do whatever you want with it." Adrian met her gaze. "And I have the small comfort of knowing I did one decent thing with all this power I've spent years accumulating." Teresa was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for deception, for the trap she clearly expected. Finally, she extended her hand. 1 month. We decode your ledgers. I finish my father's final manuscript, and then we end this arrangement cleanly. No obligations, no expectations." Adrian took her hand, feeling the ink stains on her fingers, the strength in her grip. Agreed. They shook on it, and something shifted in the room. Not romance, not yet, but possibility. The beginning of something neither of them had expected. The first week of their arrangement was a study in awkward formality. Adrian called on her precisely 3 times, bringing flowers that Teresa barely looked at, and making small talk that satisfied her younger sister's romantic notions while leaving both of them exhausted. But when they were alone in her father's study with the ledgers spread between them, something else emerged. Teresa worked with a focused intensity that reminded Adrian of generals planning campaigns. She would spend hours bent over a single page, her pen moving in swift, confident strokes, occasionally muttering to herself in languages he didn't recognize. "This cipher is based on Sanskrit root structures," she explained one evening, not looking up from her work. "But the key shifts every 3rd line using a modified Visionaire system. Whoever designed this understood that most codebreakers would give up after the first layer." "Can you break it?" Adrian asked. Teresa glanced up, and he saw something fierce in her eyes. "Your Grace, my father could read ancient Sumerian by the time he was 12. I've been breaking impossible codes since I was 10. This is difficult, not impossible." It took her 4 days. 4 days of near-constant work, fueled by tea and the stubborn determination of someone who had spent her whole life being told she wasn't capable. When she finally set down her pen and pushed the decoded ledger across the desk to him, her hands were shaking slightly. Adrian read the first page and felt ice slide down his spine. Names, dates, transactions that showed exactly how deeply the conspiracy ran. Members of Parliament, Treasury officials, even one of the Queen's own advisors. They had been siphoning money from trade routes for 18 months, covering their tracks with encrypted ledgers that no one was supposed to be able to read. "This is extraordinary," he said quietly. "This is my father's life's work," Teresa corrected. He died, believing he'd failed, because no one would listen to him, because he didn't have the right name or the right connections. She stood, moving to the window. "I won't let that happen to this." To him, Adrian looked at her silhouette against the lamplight, this woman who carried her father's legacy like a sacred trust, and felt something in his chest tighten. "You loved him very much. He was the only person who ever believed my mind was worth something." Teresa's voice was soft, almost fragile. "When I was 8, I asked him why I had to learn embroidery when I'd rather study mathematics. He said because the world is unfair to brilliant women, but that didn't mean I should stop being brilliant." Adrian set down the ledger. "Teresa." She didn't turn around. "I need to ask you something, Your Grace, and I need you to answer honestly. Anything. When this is over, when you've used this information to destroy your enemies and secure your power, what happens to me? Do I go back to being invisible? Do I spend the rest of my life giving language lessons to merchant children while men like you use my work without acknowledging where it came from?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "No," he said. "No, that's not what happens." "Then what?" She finally turned to face him. "What future do I have in a world that thinks I'm only valuable because a duke decided to notice me?" Adrian crossed the room, stopping just close enough to meet her eyes. "The future where you publish your father's work, under both your names. Where universities compete to hire you. Where the next generation of scholars studies your methods." He paused. "The future where I spend whatever political capital I have, making sure the world knows exactly who decoded these ledgers and exactly how brilliant she is." Teresa's eyes glistened, but she blinked it back. "Why would you do that? You don't owe me anything." "Because I was wrong," Adrian said simply. "Because I spent 15 years believing power meant control, and you showed me it should mean something else." He smiled, tired and genuine. "Because you're the first person in a decade who looked at me and saw past the title to the person underneath." "And who is that person?" she asked. "I don't know anymore." Adrian felt the weight of that admission. "I've been the Iron Duke for so long, I'm not sure there's anything else left." They stood in the quiet study, surrounded by books and secrets, and for the first time since his father died and left him a title too heavy to carry, Adrian let the mask slip. Just slightly, just enough. "I'm tired," he said. "Bone tired. Tired of being the man everyone fears and no one trusts. Tired of moving through rooms full of people and feeling utterly alone. Tired of winning fights that don't actually matter." Teresa watched him with those dark, intelligent eyes. "Then why do you keep fighting?" "Because it's all I know how to do." Adrian moved to the window beside her, looking out at the London night. "My father raised me to be a weapon. Sharp, cold, effective, and I was very good at it. So good that I forgot there was supposed to be something else, something human." "There still is," Teresa said quietly. "I've seen it. The way you listen when I explain my work, the way you remembered my sister's name, the way you're standing here admitting you're human instead of pretending you're not." Adrian looked at her, this woman who refused to be impressed by his title or intimidated by his reputation. "That's not the Iron Duke talking, is it? That's just you." "That's just me," he agreed. "And I have no idea what I'm doing." Teresa smiled then, a real smile that transformed her entire face. "Welcome to the rest of humanity, Your Grace. We're all making it up as we go." They stood together in the lamplight, two people who had spent their lives armored against a world that didn't know what to do with them, and for the first time in longer than either could remember, neither of them felt quite so alone. If you're still here after all that, it shows you find the story interesting. I pour my heart into these stories, spending hours, sometimes days, crafting each twist and turn, each moment of emotion, because I believe you deserve something worth your time. Stories aren't just entertainment, they're connections. They're proof that someone out there understands what it feels like to hope, to fight, to refuse to settle. Hit that button to subscribe to Forbidden Secret Love Chronicles. Also, drop a comment. Tell me what grabbed you. Your words matter more than you know. They remind me why I do this. Welcome to the Forbidden Secret Love Chronicles family. I'm so glad you're here. The betrayal came on a Thursday morning, delivered in the form of a sealed warrant bearing the Lord Chancellor's signature. Adrian was in his study reviewing grain shipment contracts when his steward brought the document, his face pale with worry. Lord Pembroke had been arrested at dawn, accused of embezzlement and treason, and the warrant listed Adrian Rios, Duke of Blackwood, as his primary co-conspirator. Adrian read the charges twice, his mind already calculating the angles. It was brilliant, really. Whoever had orchestrated this had taken the very ledgers Teresa had decoded, the ones proving the Shadow Coalition's crimes, and somehow twisted them to implicate Adrian instead. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. Meetings he'd attended, letters he'd written, financial transactions that looked suspicious when stripped of context. He sent for his solicitor immediately, but even as the man arrived with reassurances about due process and aristocratic immunity, Adrian knew the truth. This wasn't about law. This was about power. Someone had realized he was getting too close to exposing them, and they had struck first. The news spread through London like wildfire. By afternoon, Adrian's name was on every tongue, whispered in drawing rooms and shouted in taverns. The Iron Duke, finally brought low by his own ambition. Some said it was justice. Others said it was tragedy. Most simply said they had seen it coming. Adrian stood at his study window, watching the sun set over a city that had turned against him in the span of hours, and felt the cold isolation he had spent years building settle around him like a shroud. This was what he had feared most. Not the loss of power, but the confirmation that he had been right all along. Trust was a luxury he could not afford. Connection was a weakness. And the moment he had let his guard down, someone had slipped a knife between his ribs. He thought of Teresa and felt something close to relief that their arrangement had been fake, that she would not be dragged down with him. She could walk away cleanly, return to her quiet life of language lessons and her father's work. At least he had given her that much. The knock on his door came just after dark. Adrian expected his solicitor or perhaps another warrant. Instead, Teresa Salvador walked into his study, wearing a traveling cloak and carrying her father's leather portfolio, her eyes bright with fury. "You didn't send for me," she said. "It wasn't a question. There's no point." Adrian turned back to the window. "This is over. You should go home before someone sees you here and assumes you're involved." "I am involved." Teresa crossed the room and dropped the portfolio on his desk with a thud. "And I know who did this. Adrian Spoon to face her." "What?" "Professor Richard Blackthorne, Dr. James Whitmore, and Lord Chancellor Edmund Price." Teresa's voice was sharp as broken glass. "The men who stole my father's work 15 years ago. The men who discredited him when he tried to publish his findings. The men who let him die in poverty while they built their careers on his brilliance." She opened the portfolio, pulling out pages covered in her handwriting. "They're the ones running the Shadow Coalition. And when you started investigating, they realized you had someone who could decode their ledgers, someone who would recognize her father's encryption methods." Adrian stared at the evidence she had compiled. "How long have you known?" "Since the third day of decoding." Teresa met his gaze. "I recognized my father's mathematical signature in the cipher structure. He only shared those techniques with 3 of his colleagues, men he trusted, men who betrayed him. And you didn't tell me. I didn't know if I could trust you." Teresa's voice softened. You came to me wanting to use my mind as a tool. Why would I hand you a weapon against the men who destroyed my family?" She paused. "But then you changed. You started seeing me, and I realized you weren't like them." Adrian felt something crack in his chest. "They're going to destroy me, Teresa. The warrant is already issued. By tomorrow, I'll be arrested. Not if I testify." Teresa straightened her shoulders. "Not if I bring my father's original notes and prove that these men have been using his work illegally for over a decade. Not if I stand in front of the Queen's Council and expose every single crime they've committed. They'll come after you next. Let them try." Teresa's eyes blazed. "I've spent my entire life being invisible, being dismissed, being told my mind doesn't matter. Well, I'm done being invisible, and I'm done letting powerful men steal what doesn't belong to them." Adrian crossed to her, stopping just close enough to see the determination in her face. "This isn't your fight." "Yes, it is." She held his gaze. "My father died believing he failed. I won't let his work be used to destroy a good man, even if that man was arrogant enough to think he could command my cooperation." Despite everything, Adrian smiled. "I was arrogant, wasn't I?" "Insufferably so," Teresa smiled back. "But you got better." The Emergency Council convened 3 days later in the parliamentary chamber, a hastily arranged tribunal to address the charges against the Duke of Blackwood before they could tear through the government like a blade. Adrian sat in the defendant's chair, flanked by his solicitor, facing a panel of 12 lords and the Lord Chancellor himself, Edmund Price, who presided with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had already won. The evidence against Adrian was presented first. Letters, financial records, testimony from men who swore they had seen the Duke engaging in suspicious activities. It was all circumstantial, all carefully crafted to create doubt without providing proof. But in the court of public opinion, doubt was enough. Adrian's solicitor argued procedure and precedent, but the council members looked bored. They had already decided. The Iron Duke had finally overreached, and they were ready to watch him fall. Then Teresa Salvador entered the chamber. She wore a simple dress of dark blue, her hair pulled back severely, carrying her father's portfolio like a shield. The council members looked up with mild curiosity. A woman testifying in parliamentary proceedings was unusual, but not unheard of, particularly in matters of technical expertise. Edmund Price's expression flickered with something that might have been recognition, but he recovered quickly. "State your name and purpose," he said dismissively. Teresa set the portfolio on the witness table with deliberate care. "My name is Teresa Salvador, daughter of Thomas Salvador, late professor of linguistics and cryptography. I am here to present evidence that the charges against the Duke of Blackwood are not only false, but were fabricated by members of this very council." The chamber erupted. Price's gavel came down hard. "That is a serious accusation, Miss Salvador. Do you have proof?" Teresa opened the portfolio. "I have my father's original research notes on advanced cryptographic systems, dated 1835 to 1850. I have the encoded ledgers currently being used as evidence against the Duke. And I have the decoded versions, which prove that the real conspiracy involves Lord Chancellor Price, Professor Richard Blackthorne of Cambridge, and Dr. James Whitmore of the Royal Society." She began laying out documents across the table, her voice calm and precise. "My father developed a unique encryption method based on layered linguistic structures. He shared this method with only 3 colleagues, all of whom are in this room. When the Duke approached me to decode certain sensitive documents, I recognized my father's work immediately." Adrian watched her command the room with the same focused intensity she brought to her father's study. Every word was chosen with precision, every gesture calculated for maximum impact. "The ledgers show a systematic theft of Crown resources over 18 months, Teresa continued. "Trade routes were redirected, funds were siphoned, and when my father began asking questions about irregularities in Treasury documents, he was discredited and dismissed." She pulled out a specific page. "This is a letter from Lord Chancellor Price to Professor Blackthorne, dated March 1849, discussing how to silence Thomas Salvador permanently. Price shot to his feet. This is absurd. That document is clearly forged. Is it? Teresa's voice cut through his bluster. Then perhaps you can explain why the ink matches samples from your office, why the seal is identical to your personal signet, why the handwriting analysis, which I had performed by 3 independent experts, confirms it was written by you. She moved through the evidence, like a general executing a battle plan. Bank records showing unexplained deposits into Price's accounts, shipping manifests that had been altered, testimony from dock workers who had been paid to look the other way. And at the center of it all, her father's brilliant encryption system turned into a weapon against the very institutions he had tried to serve. My father died believing he was a failure, Teresa said, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. He died in poverty while these men grew rich on his work. They stole his legacy. They destroyed his reputation. And when the Duke of Blackwood began investigating their crimes, they attempted to destroy him the same way. She turned to face the council directly. The charges against the Duke are built on documents he was investigating, not creating. The meetings listed as evidence were attempts to stop the conspiracy, not join it. And the real criminals are sitting in this chamber, hiding behind their titles and their power, believing no one would dare challenge them. The silence was absolute. Every eye in the room moved between Teresa and the 3 men she had named. Price's face had gone from red to pale. Blackthorne looked like he might be sick. Whitmore was already edging toward the door. Price recovered first, his voice shaking with rage. You are the daughter of a disgraced academic, Miss Salvador. Why should this council believe anything you say? Teresa met his gaze without flinching. Because I can prove every single word. Because I have documentation that you cannot refute. And because, unlike you, Lord Chancellor, I am not afraid of the truth. She pulled out the final document, the decoded ledger showing every transaction, every crime, every name. This is what you were trying to hide. This is why you framed the Duke. Not because he was guilty, but because he was close to exposing you. Adrian watched Price's face crumble, watched the careful construction of lies fall apart under the weight of evidence and Teresa's unflinching testimony. And he felt something shift in his chest, not triumph, but awe. This brilliant woman, who had been dismissed and ignored her entire life, had just dismantled the most powerful conspiracy in England, with nothing but her mind and her father's legacy. The council voted to arrest Price, Blackthorne, and Whitmore within the hour. Adrian's charges were dismissed with formal apologies, but Adrian barely heard the proceedings. His eyes were on Teresa as she gathered her father's papers, her hands steady, her expression calm. She had just changed history, and she looked like she had simply completed another day's work. When the chamber finally cleared, Adrian found her in the corridor, standing by the tall windows overlooking the Thames. The late afternoon sun cast golden light across her face, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked at peace. You saved me, he said quietly. Teresa turned, a slight smile on her lips. I saved the truth. You were just fortunate enough to be on the right side of it. Adrian moved closer. That was the most extraordinary thing I've ever witnessed. You stood in front of the most powerful men in England and made them look like children caught in a lie. My father taught me that truth is the only power that matters. Teresa looked down at the portfolio in her hands. I just wish he could have seen it. He would have been proud. Adrian paused. I'm proud. Not just of what you did in there, but of who you are. Someone who refuses to be invisible. Someone who fights for what's right, even when it costs everything. Teresa met his eyes, and something passed between them. Not gratitude, not relief, something deeper. Do you know what I realized in that chamber? She asked. I realized that I didn't do this just to save you. I did it because somewhere between your arrogant proposal and your midnight confession, I started to care what happened to you. Adrian felt his heart stutter. Teresa, don't. She held up a hand. Don't say anything you don't mean. Our arrangement was always temporary. You've been cleared. I've exposed my father's enemies. We can end this cleanly, just like we agreed. Adrian looked at this woman, who had walked into his carefully controlled life and turned everything upside down. This woman who had refused his command and earned his respect. This woman who had saved him not with power or title, but with pure, unflinching brilliance. And he realized with absolute clarity that the idea of ending their arrangement, of walking away from her, felt like losing something essential. What if I don't want it to end? He said. Teresa blinked. What? What if I want to keep standing beside you? Not as part of a bargain or a fake courtship, but because I can't imagine going back to who I was before I met you. Adrian took a breath. You asked me who I was beneath the title. I didn't have an answer then, but I think I do now. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his signet ring, the heavy gold band that bore the Blackwood seal, the symbol of 15 generations of power and authority. He had worn it every day since his father's death, a constant reminder of duty and control. Adrian dropped to one knee in the empty corridor. Teresa's eyes went wide. What are you doing? Something I should have done weeks ago. Adrian held up the ring. This is supposed to represent power, command, the right to have people obey without question. But you taught me it should mean something else. Partnership, trust, the choice to stand beside someone because they make you better than you could ever be alone. Adrian, I'm not asking you to obey me, Teresa. I'm not offering you my protection or my name as if those things have value without your consent. Adrian felt his voice catch. I'm asking if you would consider spending your life with someone who is desperately, completely in love with you. Someone who wants nothing more than to watch you change the world with that brilliant mind. Someone who promises to never again treat you as anything less than his equal. Teresa stared at him, her dark eyes glistening. You're serious. Completely. Adrian smiled. You told me no once, in front of the entire court. It was the best thing that ever happened to me. So I'm asking again, properly this time. Will you marry me? Not because society expects it, not because it's politically convenient, but because I love you, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it. The silence stretched. Adrian stayed on his knee, the ring held between them, his heart pounding like he was 18 again instead of a man of 34 who had forgotten how to feel vulnerable. Then Teresa knelt down in front of him, bringing them eye to eye. You kneel for no one, Your Grace. Everyone knows that. I kneel for you, Adrian said. I'll kneel for you every day, if it means you'll say yes. Teresa reached out and took the ring, studying the seal with those clever eyes. This represents everything you are. Your power, your legacy, your impossible reputation. Yes, and you're offering it to me. I'm offering you everything, Adrian said. My title, my fortune, my name, my heart. All of it, on the condition that you let me be part of your work, your dreams, your father's legacy. On the condition that we face the world as partners. Teresa looked at him for a long moment. This man who had started as a cold calculation and become something infinitely more precious. Then she smiled, brilliant and genuine. Yes. Adrian felt the word hit him like physical force. Yes? Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll be your partner. Yes, I'll let you stand beside me while I change the world. Teresa slipped the ring onto her own finger, where it hung loose and heavy. But we're getting this resized, and I'm keeping my name. Adrian laughed, the sound foreign and wonderful. Anything you want. And I want my father's work published under both our names. And I want a seat on the Royal Society Council. And I want you to stop that insufferable habit of making decisions without consulting me first. Done, done, and done. Adrian pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. Anything else? Teresa's smile turned mischievous. I want you to admit that refusing you was the smartest thing I ever did. It absolutely was, Adrian agreed. Best decision of your life. They knelt together in the corridor, the evening light fading around them. Two people who had found in each other something neither had known they needed. Not rescue, not completion, but choice. The deliberate, courageous choice to stand together. The final code revealed itself 2 weeks later, hidden in the last pages of the ledger Teresa had decoded. She found it late one night in Adrian's study, now their study, surrounded by her father's books that Adrian had quietly purchased from the university that had discarded them. Adrian, she called, her voice sharp with excitement. Come look at this. He crossed from his desk, where he had been writing letters to parliamentary allies, proposals for reform that Teresa had helped him draft. What did you find? This section here. Teresa pointed to a series of symbols that looked like random notation. I thought it was just cipher debris, artifacts of the encryption process. But it's not. It's another layer. A message my father embedded inside the ledger itself. Can you decode it? Give me an hour. It took her 45 minutes. When she finally sat back, her hands were shaking, not with exhaustion, but with something that looked like disbelief. What does it say? Adrian asked. Teresa handed him the decoded message. It's a legal document, a deed transfer. My father didn't just develop the encryption system. He was contracted by the Crown to create it, with the agreement that he would receive a percentage of all trade secured by his methods. She looked up, her eyes wide. He was entitled to an estate. Land, property, a permanent income. He never knew. They never told him. Adrian read the document carefully, his legal training picking out the critical details. This is binding. If your father created the cipher system and the Crown used it, you're entitled to inherit everything promised in this contract. That's not possible. Teresa stood, pacing the room. My father died with nothing. We had to sell his books to pay for his funeral. How could there be an estate? Because someone hid it from him, Adrian said grimly. Someone who knew that if Thomas Salvador claimed his rightful compensation, their own theft would be exposed. He looked at the names listed as witnesses on the deed. Price and Blackthorne. They knew what your father was owed. They made sure he never got it. Teresa pressed her hands to her face. He died thinking he was a failure, thinking his life's work was worthless. And the whole time, he had earned everything they told him he didn't deserve. Adrian crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. We'll make it right. We'll file the claim. We'll make sure the Crown honors this contract. Your father's legacy won't just be his brilliant mind. It will be the estate he earned, the recognition he deserved, the justice that was stolen from him. Teresa clung to him, her voice muffled against his shoulder. I want his name on everything. I want everyone to know what Thomas Salvador created, what he deserved, what they took from him. They will, Adrian promised. I swear to you they will. The claim was filed within days. The Crown's solicitors tried to argue the contract was void, but Adrian had resources they couldn't match. Lawyers, political pressure, and most importantly, Teresa herself, who stood before the Crown's tribunal and explained in precise, devastating detail exactly how her father's work had been used and how the men who stole it had betrayed both the Crown and basic human decency. The estate was granted 3 months later. A manor house in Sussex with 200 acres of land, a quarterly income drawn from trade revenues that had been accumulating untouched for 15 years. And most precious of all, a formal apology from the Crown acknowledging Thomas Salvador's contribution to British economic security. Teresa stood in the manor's library, surrounded by empty shelves waiting to be filled with her father's books, and wept. Not from grief, but from the overwhelming relief of justice finally, impossibly served. Adrian found her there as the sun set through the tall windows, painting everything gold. This is yours, he said softly. Your father's legacy, your future. Teresa turned to him, her face streaked with tears but smiling. Our future. She crossed to him, taking his hands. I couldn't have done this without you, without your resources, your name, your stubborn refusal to let me face this alone. You would have found another way. Adrian kissed her forehead. You're brilliant enough to move mountains. Maybe. But I'm glad I didn't have to. Teresa leaned into him. I'm glad I had you beside me. They stood together in the library of a house that represented everything Thomas Salvador should have had, everything his daughter had fought to reclaim. And in the quiet of that moment, surrounded by possibility and justice and love, they both felt the weight of old ghosts finally laid to rest. The wedding took place 6 months later in a small ceremony that scandalized London and delighted everyone who mattered. Teresa wore crimson because she refused to be a blushing bride in white. Adrian wore his formal ducal regalia, but left his signet ring on her finger, where it had been resized to fit perfectly. The vows were traditional, but the promises they made afterward were entirely their own. Teresa promised to never stop challenging him. Adrian promised to never take her brilliance for granted. They promised to build something new together, a partnership that honored both their strengths and their stubborn, impossible hearts. The reception was held at the Salvador estate, the manor now filled with books and scientific instruments and the quiet hum of intellectual work. Teresa's sister danced with a young professor who looked at her like she hung the stars. Adrian's political allies mingled with Teresa's academic colleagues, creating connections that would reshape British policy for the next generation. But the moment Adrian remembered most clearly came late in the evening, when he found Teresa standing in her father's study, now her study, looking at the portrait they had commissioned. Thomas Salvador, painted from the single photograph they had found, his eyes intelligent and kind, his expression peaceful. He would have liked you, Teresa said, not looking away from the portrait. My father. He would have appreciated the way you see people's potential instead of their limitations. Adrian put his arm around her waist. I wish I could have met him. You carry his legacy every day. Teresa leaned into him. The estate, the published works, the scholarships we're funding in his name. He's not forgotten. Because of you. Because of us. Teresa turned to face him. You gave me the resources. But we built this together. Adrian kissed her. Slow and gentle, tasting champagne and the future. Together, he agreed. Always. In the months and years that followed, the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood became known as the most powerful couple in England. But their power wasn't built on fear or control. It was built on partnership, on the revolutionary idea that two brilliant minds working in harmony could change more than either could alone. Teresa published her father's complete works, with annotations explaining their modern applications. The academic community that had once dismissed Thomas Salvador now studied his methods as foundational texts. The scholarships they established brought dozens of brilliant young minds into research positions that would have been closed to them otherwise. Adrian used his political influence differently now, not to command but to create space for voices that had been silenced. He fought for reforms that gave women legal rights to their own intellectual property. He championed education initiatives that Teresa designed. And he learned, slowly but thoroughly, that real power wasn't about making people fear you. It was about earning their trust. On their first anniversary, they stood together in the House of Lords as Teresa presented her research on advanced cryptographic systems to a room full of men who had spent decades pretending women couldn't understand such things. Adrian watched her command the chamber with the same fierce intelligence that had first captivated him, and felt his heart swell with pride and love, and the bone-deep satisfaction of knowing he had chosen right. After her presentation, as the Lords stood and applauded, genuinely impressed despite themselves, Adrian caught Teresa's eye. She smiled at him, that brilliant, private smile that was just for him, and mouthed 2 words. "Thank you," Adrian mouthed back. Always. Because that was the promise they had made. Not just in their vows, but in every day since Teresa had first told him no. The promise to stand together, to challenge each other, to build something that honored both their strengths and their love. The Iron Duke had learned to kneel, and in that surrender, he had found something infinitely more valuable than power. He had found partnership, purpose, home. And Teresa Salvador, the woman who had refused to say yes, had discovered that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone stand beside you, not to rescue you or complete you, but to choose you every day, in full knowledge of who you are and what you're capable of becoming. Together, they changed the world, not through fear or control, but through the quiet, revolutionary act of seeing each other truly and choosing to build something better. Years later, when historians wrote about the reforms that transformed Victorian England, they would point to the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood as the catalysts. But those who knew them personally understood the truth. It wasn't titles or power that changed history. It was 2 people who had the courage to say no to what the world expected and yes to what they could become together. The Salvador estate remained their home, filled with books and research, and the laughter of the children who would inherit both their parents' brilliance and their radical belief in partnership. The portrait of Thomas Salvador hung in the place of honor, a reminder that legacy isn't just what you leave behind, it's what others carry forward in your name. And every year on the anniversary of that first refusal, Adrian would kneel before Teresa again, not in surrender, but in celebration, celebrating the woman who had taught him that true strength wasn't about standing alone. It was about having the courage to stand together. Teresa would smile and pull him to his feet, because they were equals in all things, and they would spend the evening in each other's arms, grateful for the scandalous, impossible, perfect love they had built from a single, world-changing word. No, the beginning of everything. Before you close this page, before you move on to whatever's next in your day, I want you to know something. This story took hours to craft. Every word, every moment, every emotion was chosen because I believe you deserve to feel something real. Stories like this, they're not just entertainment. They're a reminder that courage exists, that love is possible, that standing up for what's right, even when it's terrifying, can change everything. If Teresa and Adrian's journey moved you, if you felt that moment when she said no and changed both their lives, if you found yourself hoping they'd find their way to each other, then this story did what it was meant to do. It connected with you, and that connection matters more than you might think. Hit that subscribe button. Not for me, but because you deserve more moments like this, more stories that remind you what it feels like to believe in something, more proof that the underdogs can win, that honesty beats manipulation, that partnership is stronger than power. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me which moment grabbed your heart. Tell me if you've ever had to say no to something everyone expected you to say yes to. Your words, your story, they matter to this community. We're building something here, a place where people who refuse to settle can find stories that honor that refusal. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters. Hit that notification bell, because the next story might be exactly what you need, exactly when you need it. And I don't want you to miss that moment. Welcome to the Forbidden Secret Love Chronicles family. Thank you for being here. Thank you for letting these characters into your heart. Thank you for believing that stories still matter. You matter. And I'll be here, crafting the next tale, whenever you're ready to feel something real again.